Good evening, and welcome to Slumber Scrolls. Tonight, we descend into the depths of the wine-dark sea, into the realm of crashing waves and trembling earth, to explore the life of one of the most powerful and temperamental deities the ancient Greeks ever worshipped. Please like and subscribe before we dive beneath the waves. Before we begin our journey, it's important to remember that Greek mythology is not a single, unified story. These tales reached us through many voices across many centuries. Poets like Homer and Hesiod, playwrights like Euripides, and countless others who told and retold these stories, each adding their own details, sometimes agreeing, sometimes offering fascinating contradictions. Where the myths diverge, we'll explore the most widely accepted versions while acknowledging when other traditions existed. Get comfortable, settle in, and let us begin our journey through the mythic life of Poseidon, the Earthshaker, Lord of the Seas. The world into which Poseidon was born. To understand Poseidon, we must first understand the world that shaped him, a world ruled by fear and prophecy, where fathers devoured their children and the cosmic order balanced on the edge of violence. In those ancient days, before Zeus ruled from Olympus, before the great war that would reshape the cosmos, the world belonged to the Titans. These were not the refined deities of later ages, but primal forces, beings whose very existence was bound to the fundamental powers of creation. They were the children of Gaia, the earth herself, and Uranus, the starry sky, and they ruled with a majesty that seemed eternal. Among the Titans, one stood out for his cunning and his ambition. Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, had overthrown his own father in an act of terrible violence, wielding a sickle fashioned by Gaia herself to castrate Uranus and claim dominion over the cosmos. For a time, this act of rebellion brought order. The age that followed became known as the Golden Age, a time when the earth gave forth its bounty without labor, when justice walked among mortals, and when the world seemed balanced and whole. But Cronus carried with him a burden that would poison his rule. As Uranus fell, wounded and defeated, he spoke words that were both curse and prophecy. "As you have overthrown me," Uranus said, "so too shall you be overthrown by your own son." The words echoed across the cosmos, settling into Cronus's mind like a seed that would grow into poisonous fruit. Cronus took Rhea as his wife, his own sister, as was the way among the Titans. She was a Titaness of great wisdom and gentle strength, embodying the nurturing aspects of the earth. Together they ruled from Mount Othrys in the south, and for a time their union seemed blessed. But the prophecy haunted Cronus, twisting his thoughts, transforming every moment of joy into suspicion. When Rhea grew heavy with their first child, Cronus felt not pride but fear. The birth of that first child, a daughter they named Hestia, should have been a moment of celebration. Instead, it became the first act in a tragedy that would span years. Cronus, driven by his terror of the prophecy, made a decision that would define him for all eternity. He took the newborn infant from Rhea's arms and, before his horrified wife could stop him, swallowed the child whole. Rhea's anguish was beyond words. She had carried this child within her, had given birth in pain and hope, only to watch her husband consume their daughter in a single terrible moment. But when she pleaded with Cronus, when she begged him to see reason, he was unmoved. "The prophecy must be prevented," he said. "The throne must be protected. No child of his would live to overthrow him." And so the pattern repeated. A second daughter came, Demeter, and she too disappeared down Cronus's throat before she could draw her second breath. A third daughter, Hera, suffered the same fate. The children were not dead. They were trapped, alive but imprisoned in the darkness of their father's belly, suspended in a limbo between existence and non-existence. Poseidon's birth and imprisonment when Rhea conceived again. She knew before the child was born that it would be a son. The birth came, and it was indeed a son. The ancient sources differ on what happened next. Some traditions, preserved by writers like Pausanias, tell that Rhea briefly hid him, either on the island of Rhodes with the Telchines, those ancient sea spirits skilled in metalwork, or in Arcadia near a spring called Arne, surrounded by a flock of lambs to muffle his cries. According to these versions, Rhea gave Cronus a foal to swallow instead of the infant, just as she would later give him a stone in place of Zeus. But most sources present a simpler and more tragic account. Rhea, worn down by grief and fear after losing 3 children already, could not devise a plan quickly enough to save this son. She named him Poseidon, a name that may have meant husband of the earth, or lord of the waters, though its exact etymology was lost even to the ancient Greeks themselves. And then, with tears streaming down her face, she handed him to Cronus. The Titan king took his 4th child and swallowed him without hesitation, just as he had swallowed the others. Poseidon joined his siblings in that terrible prison, trapped in darkness, unable to die but unable to truly live. There, in the belly of his father, Poseidon would remain for years uncounted, growing somehow despite his imprisonment, aging in that lightless place while the world outside continued its cycles. The ancient sources tell us nothing of what those imprisoned years were like for Poseidon and his siblings. We can only imagine the darkness, the waiting, the slow passage of time in that terrible prison. Whatever the experience was, it may have shaped the god who would emerge, perhaps contributing to the temperamental nature and fierce independence that would define him in later myths. Meanwhile, Rhea's grief only deepened. She had now lost 4 children to her husband's paranoia. When she became pregnant with a 5th child, another son, she could barely stand to think about what would happen when the birth came. This child was called Hades, and like his brother before him, he was swallowed by Cronus almost the moment he entered the world. 5 children now dwelt in their father's belly. 5 gods in waiting, trapped and growing, nursing their rage and their hunger for freedom in that terrible prison. Cronus believed himself safe, believed that he had successfully thwarted the prophecy. But prophecies have a way of fulfilling themselves, especially when those who fight against them take actions that guarantee their own downfall. When Rhea conceived a 6th time, something in her broke and then reformed, harder and more determined than before. She would not allow this child to be swallowed. She would not suffer through another birth only to watch her infant disappear. This time, she would fight back. This time, she would be clever. She went in secret to her mother Gaia, the primordial earth, who had suffered her own betrayals at the hands of both Uranus and Cronus. Together, grandmother and daughter devised a plan. Rhea would flee to Crete, to a hidden cave on Mount Ida or Mount Dicte. The sources disagree on the exact location, and there she would give birth in secret. In place of the child, she would give Cronus a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes, trusting that his paranoia had made him careless enough to swallow without looking. The plan worked. Cronus swallowed the stone, believing he had consumed his 6th child, never noticing the deception. And in Crete, in that sacred cave, Rhea gave birth to Zeus, the child who would eventually free his siblings, the child who would overthrow the Titan king, the child who would fulfill the prophecy despite all of Cronus's efforts to prevent it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, Poseidon remained trapped, imprisoned alongside Hestia, Demeter, Hera, and Hades, while Zeus grew in secret in the Cretan cave. The years passed, and the world continued its cycles, unaware that beneath Mount Othrys, inside the belly of its king, 5 gods were waiting. Waiting for freedom, waiting for revenge, waiting for the day when they would finally see the world they had been born into but never allowed to experience. That day would come, but not yet, not for many years. For now, there was only darkness and patience and the slow, steady growth of divine power that even imprisonment could not contain. The liberation and the Titanomachy, the liberation came suddenly, violently, and with a finality that Cronus had never imagined possible. Zeus, grown to adulthood in his Cretan cave, had learned the truth of his family from Gaia. He knew about his siblings, trapped in the darkness. He knew about his father's crimes, the swallowing of children out of fear, and he knew that it fell to him to bring justice to the cosmos, to fulfill the prophecy that Uranus had spoken so long ago. But Zeus understood something that Cronus had not, that prophecies cannot be fought with strength alone, but must be met with wisdom. So he sought out Métis, an Oceanid Titaness whose name itself meant cunning intelligence. Métis listened to Zeus's tale and devised a plan. She concocted a powerful emetic, a potion that would force Cronus to vomit up everything he had swallowed. The mixture was bitter and strong, disguised as wine or nectar, something Cronus would drink without suspicion. Zeus approached his father, some stories say in disguise, others say openly as a cupbearer, and offered him the doctored drink. Cronus, secure in his power and unsuspecting of the trap, drank it down. Almost immediately, his body rebelled. A terrible nausea seized him, and his stomach convulsed with violent force. And then came the stone, the false Zeus wrapped in its swaddling clothes, expelled from Cronus's mouth and falling to the ground with a heavy thud. The Titan king stared at it in confusion and dawning horror. If that was a stone, then what had he been carrying all these years? The answer came immediately. Poseidon emerged next from his father's body, no longer an infant but fully grown, his years of imprisonment somehow aging him despite his confinement. He came forth with the fury of the sea in his eyes, his body strong and his will unbroken. After Poseidon came Hades, dark and grim, his long imprisonment in darkness having made him more comfortable with shadows than light. Then Hera, regal and proud, her dignity intact despite the indignity of her ordeal. Demeter followed, her connection to the growing things of earth somehow maintained even in that lightless prison. And finally Hestia, the eldest, the first swallowed and the last freed, emerged gentle and serene despite everything she had endured. The 6 children of Cronus and Rhea stood together for the first time, and the sight of them was enough to make the Titan king realize the depth of his failure. They were gods in their own right, not diminished by their imprisonment, but perhaps strengthened by it, tempered like metal in a forge. And in their eyes was not forgiveness, but judgment. Poseidon stood among his siblings, feeling the weight of the world around him for the first time, the air moving across his skin, the solid ground beneath his feet, the vast open space above, no longer confined by the walls of flesh that had been his only world. And in that moment, he knew what he wanted. He could feel it calling to him, though he had never seen it. The sea, the vast waters that covered most of the world. That would be his domain, if he could claim it. But first, there was a war to fight. Cronus would not surrender his throne willingly, and the other Titans would rally to his defense. The battle for the cosmos was about to begin, and Poseidon and his siblings would need more than their own strength to prevail. Zeus, as the orchestrator of their liberation, naturally took the lead. He reminded his siblings of their imprisonment, of the injustice they had suffered. He spoke of the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchirs, their uncles, who had been imprisoned even longer, locked away in the depths of Tartarus by first Uranus and then Cronus. If they could free these ancient beings, they would have powerful allies in the war to come. Together, the 6 siblings descended into Tartarus, that deepest and darkest of places. The journey was treacherous, taking them through layers of reality, deeper and deeper into the foundations of the world. And there, in the lowest pits, they found their uncles. The Cyclopes, with their single burning eyes, had grown dim from ages in darkness. The Hecatonchirs, the 100-handed giants with 50 heads each, sat in despair, their tremendous strength useless against their bonds. Guarding them was Camp, a monstrous creature placed there by Cronus specifically to ensure these beings never escaped. Poseidon watched as Zeus fought the monster, and he learned something about his youngest brother in that moment. Zeus was not just powerful. He was determined, willing to fight without hesitation for what he believed was right. When camp fell, slain by Zeus's attacks, the prisoners were freed, blinking in what little light existed in those depths. The Cyclopes looked upon their liberators with gratitude and something more, recognition. These young guards had done what none had done before. They had stood against the Titan king and freed those he had imprisoned. When the Cyclopes offered to forge weapons for their rescuers, Poseidon stepped forward eagerly. In the forges that existed in those deep places, where the fire of the earth still burned hot and ancient, the Cyclopes worked their craft. For Zeus, they forged thunderbolts, jagged spears of pure lightning. For Hades, they created a helm of darkness that would make its wearer invisible. And for Poseidon, they crafted something magnificent, a trident, a three-pronged spear that would become the most recognizable symbol of his power. The trident was more than just a weapon. It was an extension of Poseidon's will, a tool that would allow him to command the very forces of nature. With it, he could stir the seas into fury or calm them to glass-like smoothness. He could strike the earth and cause it to tremble, opening fissures or raising springs. The three prongs represented his authority over the waters in all their forms, the seas, the rivers, and the springs that fed the land. Armed and ready, with the Cyclopes and Hecatonchires as their allies, the 6 siblings emerged from Tartarus and made their way to Mount Olympus in the north, the highest peak in all of Greece. There they established their base, claiming the mountain as their own, while Cronus gathered his forces at Mount Othrys in the south. The war that followed would be known as the Titanomachy, and it would rage for 10 years, scarring the earth and shaking the heavens. Poseidon fought alongside his siblings, and he discovered in himself a capacity for both creation and destruction. With his trident, he could raise enormous waves that crashed down upon the enemy. He could cause earthquakes that threw the Titans off balance. He could create whirlpools that swallowed anything that came near them. The Hecatonchires proved to be devastating weapons in their own right. When they entered battle, their 100 hands would tear boulders from mountains and hurl them in continuous barrages. Poseidon watched in awe as these ancient giants unleashed their fury, each stone they threw like a meteor, crushing anything it struck. The war was not just a battle of strength, but of wills. The Titans had ruled for untold ages. They were experienced, powerful, and determined to maintain their dominion. But the Olympians, as Zeus and his siblings came to be called, fought with the desperation of those who had been wronged, with the fury of those who had spent years imprisoned, dreaming of freedom. Poseidon faced his father across the battlefield more than once. Each time, there was a moment where their eyes met, and Poseidon could see in Cronus's gaze a mixture of fear and regret. But regret changes nothing. It cannot undo the years of imprisonment, cannot erase the trauma of swallowing children to prevent a prophecy that came true anyway. The turning point came when Zeus led a direct assault on Mount Othrys itself. The Hecatonchires surrounded the mountain, hurling boulders from every direction, while Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades led the charge up its slopes. Poseidon's trident struck the earth, causing massive tremors that weakened the Titans' defenses. Zeus's thunderbolts lit up the sky, striking with devastating accuracy. Hades moved unseen among the enemy, his helm of darkness making him a ghost on the battlefield. When Cronus finally fell, struck down by Zeus's lightning, the other Titans quickly surrendered. They knew defeat when they saw it. The old order was finished. A new age was beginning. The victorious Olympians rounded up the defeated Titans and cast them into Tartarus, the same prison where the Cyclopes and Hecatonchires had been held. Bronze gates were forged and set in place, guarded by the same beings who had helped win the war. There the Titans would remain, locked away where they could never again threaten the peace of the cosmos. But Poseidon and his siblings had no interest in simple revenge. They wanted to build something better, a rule that would be more just than what had come before. And the first step in that process was to divide the cosmos among themselves, to establish clear domains and responsibilities so that no single god would have absolute power. Standing among the rubble of Mount Othrys, with the war finally over and the future stretching before them like an uncharted sea, Poseidon looked at his siblings and wondered, what would his place be in this new order? What domain would fall to him? He did not have to wait long to find out. The division of the cosmos in the aftermath of victory, with the Titans locked away and the cosmos in need of new rulers, the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, faced a question that had brought down kingdoms since time immemorial: how to divide power fairly among equals. Each had played crucial roles in the war. Zeus had orchestrated their liberation and led them to victory. Poseidon had commanded the seas and shaken the earth, turning the very ground into a weapon. Hades had moved unseen through enemy lines, striking from the shadows with devastating effect. They were brothers, allies, and now they needed to become something more, joint rulers of all existence. The sisters, too, had their places in the new order. Hestia, the eldest, would become goddess of the hearth, the sacred center of every home. Demeter would claim dominion over the harvest and the growing things of earth. Hera would become queen of the gods, standing beside Zeus as his consort. But it was understood that the primary division of cosmic power would be among the three brothers, for they represented the three great realms into which the universe could be divided. According to the most common tradition, the three brothers drew lots to determine who would rule which domain. In a vessel they placed three tokens, each representing one of the three realms. The drawing was conducted with solemnity, for this decision would determine the shape of existence itself for ages to come. To Zeus fell the sky, the broad heavens stretching from horizon to horizon. He would command the clouds and rain, the lightning and thunder. His would be the highest realm, the most visible, touching all parts of the world. It was fitting perhaps that Zeus, who had orchestrated their freedom and led them to victory, should claim the sky as his domain. To Hades fell the underworld, the realm of the dead. It was not punishment, despite what later tales might suggest. The underworld was a necessary part of the cosmic order, the place where mortal souls would go after death to be judged and assigned their eternal fate. Hades would become the steward of this realm, the administrator of death itself, maintaining the boundary between life and death. His kingdom extended beneath all the earth, vast and dark but essential to the balance of existence. And to Poseidon fell the sea. When Poseidon drew that lot, something in him responded immediately, as if he had always known this would be his domain. The sea was vast, covering more of the earth's surface than dry land. It was deep, its lowest trenches descending farther than the highest mountains rose. It was powerful, capable of gentle beauty or devastating fury. It was mysterious, home to creatures both wondrous and terrible. It was, in short, a domain worthy of a god. The earth itself, the solid land where mortals would live and build their civilizations, was declared a common realm. No single god would claim exclusive dominion over it. Instead, it would be a place where all the gods could walk, where their influences would overlap and intersect. This was meant to prevent any one deity from accumulating too much power, to create a system of checks and balances that would keep the new order stable. Poseidon descended to the depths of the sea for the first time as its rightful lord. The water welcomed him, parting before his passage, responding to his will as naturally as he breathed. He found places in the deep where golden palaces could be built, where he could establish his seat of power. Near Aegae in Euboea, the tradition said, he created magnificent underwater mansions, adorned with coral and sea flowers, lit by bioluminescent creatures that had evolved to create their own light in the darkness. In these depths, Poseidon was truly alone for the first time in his existence, not imprisoned, as he had been in his father's belly, but solitary by choice. The weight of the water above him was immense, but he felt no pressure. Instead, He felt the connection between himself and this vast realm, felt the currents responding to his thoughts, felt the countless living things that called these waters home becoming aware of their new lord. He explored the ocean floor, swimming through trenches that descended into near-total darkness. He raced across the surface, feeling the wind on his face and watching the way sunlight danced on the waves. He dove to the deep places where heat vented from cracks in the earth, where exotic creatures clustered around the warmth. He visited the shallow coasts where the sea met the land, where mortals would eventually build their ports and launch their ships. And as he explored, Poseidon began to understand the true nature of his domain. The sea was not just water. It was life itself. Every living thing in the ocean was now under his protection and his command. The fish that schooled in the sunlit shallows, the whales that sang their songs across vast distances, the creatures of the deep who had never seen light. All of them were his subjects now. But the sea was also death. It could swallow ships whole, could drown anyone who disrespected its power. It could create storms that ravaged coastlines, could send tsunamis that wiped away entire settlements. The sea gave life, but it also took life away, and Poseidon was lord of both aspects. He found that his trident responded to the sea as if they were made for each other. When he struck it against the ocean floor, springs of fresh water would sometimes burst forth, even in the depths of the salt sea. When he pointed it toward the surface, waves would rise or fall according to his will. The three prongs seemed to resonate with the different states of water, liquid, ice, and vapor, giving him command over all the forms his element could take. Poseidon also discovered that his domain extended beyond just the sea itself. The rivers that flowed to the ocean were under his influence, at least at their mouths where fresh water mixed with salt. Springs and wells that connected to underground water sources sometimes fell within his purview, and earthquakes, caused by the shifting of the earth beneath the sea, became one of his signature powers, earning him the title of Earthshaker. But for all the majesty of his realm, Poseidon soon realized that his domain came with a certain isolation. Zeus ruled the sky, which everyone could see. Mortals would look up and know that Zeus was watching. Hades ruled the underworld, where all mortals would eventually go. But Poseidon's kingdom was hidden beneath the waves, vast and magnificent but unseen by most. Sailors would cross the surface of his realm without ever knowing what lay beneath. Cities would rise on the coasts, taking from the sea but rarely acknowledging its depths. This realization planted something in Poseidon's heart, a seed of resentment that would grow over time. He was not jealous exactly, but he felt the need to make himself known, to ensure that his power was acknowledged, that his domain was respected. Where Zeus could simply show himself in the sky and be recognized, Poseidon would have to be more demonstrative, more assertive. He began to make his presence known through his actions. When ships sailed, they would offer prayers and sacrifices to Poseidon for safe passage, for he could calm the seas or stir them to fury. Coastal cities would build temples to honor him, knowing that their prosperity depended on his favor. Fishermen would invoke his name before casting their nets, hoping he would grant them an abundant catch. The trident became his symbol, recognized across the Greek world as the mark of the sea god's authority. When mortals saw images of that three-pronged spear, they knew immediately whom it represented. When they saw dolphins, which became sacred to Poseidon, they knew the sea god was nearby. When they witnessed his power in a storm or an earthquake, they understood that this was a god who demanded respect, a force that could not be ignored. And yet, despite his power and the respect it commanded, Poseidon could never quite shake the feeling that he was, in some fundamental way, separate from the other gods. Zeus held court on Mount Olympus, where all the gods gathered. Hades ruled his dark kingdom below. But Poseidon's true home was beneath the waves, in those golden palaces where no other god could easily visit, in a realm of pressure and depth that was his alone. Perhaps it was this isolation that contributed to the temperament Poseidon would become known for. Perhaps it was the nature of the sea itself, beautiful but dangerous, nurturing but destructive, that shaped his personality. Or perhaps it was simply who he was, who he had always been since those dark days imprisoned in his father's belly. Whatever the reason, Poseidon would become known as one of the most powerful, but also one of the most temperamental of the Olympian gods. Generous to those who honored him, terrible to those who offended him, capable of creating new islands and blessing sailors with calm seas, but equally capable of unleashing storms that could devastate entire coastlines. He was the sea made manifest, and like the sea, he was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Powers and symbols of the sea god. To truly understand Poseidon, one must understand the powers he wielded and the symbols that represented him, for these were not mere attributes but expressions of his fundamental nature. The trident, that three-pronged spear forged by the Cyclopes in the depths of Tartarus, was more than just a weapon in Poseidon's hands. It was an extension of his will, a tool through which he channeled his divine authority over the natural world. With a single strike of that trident against solid rock, Poseidon could bring forth springs of water, creating sources of fresh water in the most unlikely places. The ancient Greeks told of how he struck the ground on the Acropolis in Athens, creating a saltwater spring, or in other locations bringing forth sweet water that would sustain communities for generations. But the trident was equally an instrument of destruction. When Poseidon struck the earth in anger, the ground would split open, creating earthquakes that could level cities. He could thrust it into the sea and stir up storms that would scatter fleets like leaves in the wind. The three prongs were said by some to represent different aspects of his power: his dominion over the sea, his control over earthquakes, and his connection to horses. Others said they symbolized the three forms of water: liquid, solid, and vapor. Still others saw in them a symbol of his ability to command the past, present, and future of the waters. Horses, surprisingly to modern audiences who might associate them primarily with land, were deeply sacred to Poseidon. The ancient Greeks believed that he had created the first horse, that magnificent creature that symbolized both power and grace. In some versions of the myth, Poseidon created horses when competing with Athena for the patronage of Athens. In others, the first horse simply sprang forth from the sea foam at his command, born from the same creative force that could shape water into whatever form the god desired. The connection between Poseidon and horses went deeper than simple creation. Many of his children took equine form or were closely associated with horses. The winged horse Pegasus, born from the blood of Medusa, was Poseidon's son. Arion, a talking horse of incredible speed, was another of his offspring. The hippocampi, those mythical creatures that were half horse and half fish, were said to draw Poseidon's chariot through the depths of the ocean, their horse bodies perfectly transitioning into fish tails, embodying the god's dominion over both land animals and sea creatures. In landlocked regions like Arcadia, far from the sea, Poseidon was sometimes worshipped primarily as a horse god, known as Poseidon. Hippios. This might seem strange for a sea deity, but it speaks to something fundamental about how the ancient Greeks understood him. Poseidon was not just the god of water. He was a god of raw, untamed power, of natural forces that could not be fully controlled. Horses, with their strength and speed, their capacity for both gentleness and wildness, embodied these same qualities. The bull was another of Poseidon's sacred animals. Bulls were frequently sacrificed to him, their strength and power making them appropriate offerings for such a mighty deity. The most famous bull associated with Poseidon was the Cretan bull, which later became father to the Minotaur. When King Minos of Crete prayed to Poseidon for a sign, the god sent a magnificent white bull from the sea, so beautiful that Minos could not bring himself to sacrifice it as he had promised. This act of disrespect would have terrible consequences, as Poseidon's wrath typically did when he was offended. Dolphins were perhaps the most beloved of Poseidon's sacred creatures among the Greeks. These intelligent, playful animals were seen as friends to sailors, as creatures that would guide lost ships to shore and rescue drowning men. The Greeks told stories of dolphins carrying messages for Poseidon, of how the god would sometimes take the form of a dolphin, of how these creatures were so beloved by him that harming one would bring down his fury. The constellation Delphinus was placed in the sky by Poseidon in honor of a particular dolphin who had helped him win the heart of his future wife. The sea itself, in all its moods and manifestations, was of course the ultimate symbol of Poseidon's power. When the Greeks looked upon the ocean, they saw the visible expression of the god's nature. The calm sea, glittering in the sunlight, represented Poseidon's benevolent aspect. He was worshipped as Poseidon Soter, Poseidon the Savior, by sailors who depended on his goodwill for safe voyages. Prayers and libations would be poured into the waves before embarking on any sea journey, and offerings would be made in thanksgiving after safe arrival in port. But the sea could also be terrifying, and this too was Poseidon. When storms arose, when waves grew mountainous and winds howled, when the sea turned from blue to grey to black, ancient sailors knew they were witnessing the god's wrath. Ships would be tossed like toys, smashed against rocks or dragged down into the depths. Entire fleets could be scattered or destroyed by a single storm, and the Greeks understood these catastrophes as expressions of divine anger. Poseidon was worshipped as the earth-shaker, Enosegeos, the god whose moods could literally remake the landscape. Earthquakes were particularly associated with Poseidon in the Greek mind. The ancient Greeks, living in a seismically active region, experienced these terrifying events regularly. They did not understand the geological forces behind earthquakes, but they recognized their awesome power. When the earth shook, when buildings collapsed and fissures opened in the ground, they attributed these events to Poseidon striking the earth with his trident. In some traditions, it was said that the god created earthquakes when he moved through the deep passages beneath the earth's surface, his passage causing tremors above. Interestingly, despite being the cause of earthquakes, Poseidon was also sometimes worshipped as a protector against them. He was known as Poseidon Asphalios, Poseidon the Steadier, and temples were built to him specifically to ask for protection from seismic disasters. This dual nature, being both the cause of catastrophe and the protection from it, perfectly embodied Poseidon's complex character. He could be the problem or the solution, the danger or the salvation, depending on his mood and how he was honored. The pine tree and wild celery were sacred plants to Poseidon. Winners at his Isthmian Games were crowned with wreaths of wild celery, connecting athletic victory to the god's favor. The pine tree, with its ability to grow near the sea and its wood being used for shipbuilding, had an obvious connection to the maritime aspects of his domain. In art and literature, Poseidon was typically depicted as a mature man, powerful and bearded, often wielding his trident. Unlike the serene majesty sometimes attributed to Zeus, Poseidon's representations often captured movement and energy. He might be shown stirring up waves, or riding his chariot drawn by hippocampi, or striding through the sea with water streaming from his beard and hair. The Greeks did not picture him as calm or contemplative. He was active, dynamic, embodying the restless nature of the sea itself. When artists wanted to show his connection to horses, they might depict him with those creatures, or riding a chariot drawn by horses rather than sea creatures, blurring the line between his maritime and terrestrial aspects. When emphasizing his role in earthquakes, he might be shown with his trident striking the ground, cracks spreading from the point of impact. The Romans, who identified Poseidon with their own god Neptune, largely maintained these associations, though they tended to emphasize his maritime aspects over his connection to earthquakes and horses. The image of the sea god remained consistent, powerful, temperamental, wielding his trident with authority over the vast waters and the forces hidden within and beneath them. These powers and symbols were not arbitrary, They reflected the real experiences of the ancient Greeks with the sea and with natural disasters. They reflected a world where water was essential to survival, where maritime trade was the lifeblood of civilization, where storms could bring prosperity or ruin. Poseidon, in all his complexity and contradictions, was the Greeks' way of understanding and relating to these forces. He was the personification of nature's power, creative and destructive, nurturing and terrifying, beautiful and deadly. The temperament of the sea god, if there is one thing that defined Poseidon in the eyes of the ancient Greeks, it was his temperament. Where Zeus might deliberate before striking with his thunderbolt, where Athena might strategize before acting, Poseidon was known for his immediate, visceral reactions. He was a god of extremes, capable of great generosity but equally capable of terrible vengeance, and the line between these two states could be crossed in an instant. This temperamental nature was not seen as a flaw by the Greeks, but rather as an inherent part of who Poseidon was. The sea itself is mercurial, calm one moment, raging the next, with little warning of when it might turn from friend to foe. Poseidon embodied this quality completely. He was the god who could grant safe passage and abundant catches, who could bring prosperity to coastal cities, but he was also the god who could sink ships on a whim, who could flood entire regions when offended, who could pursue those who wronged him with relentless, implacable fury. The story of Odysseus and the Cyclops Polyphemus provides perhaps the most famous example of Poseidon's wrath and his determination to punish those who offended him. Odysseus, that clever hero who had helped win the Trojan War for the Greeks, had the misfortune to land on the island where the Cyclopes dwelt. These were one-eyed giants, sons of Poseidon, who lived as shepherds and cared nothing for the rules of hospitality that governed civilized society. Odysseus and his men entered the cave of Polyphemus, the greatest of the Cyclopes, hoping to receive guest gifts as was customary. Instead, they found themselves trapped, and Polyphemus began devouring Odysseus's companions, two at a time, with horrifying casualness. The giant was treating them not as guests but as livestock, and Odysseus knew that unless he acted, all his men would share the same fate. With characteristic cunning, Odysseus got Polyphemus drunk on strong wine and told the giant his name was Nobody. Then, while the Cyclops slept off his intoxication, Odysseus and his remaining men drove a burning stake into Polyphemus's single eye, blinding him. When the other Cyclopes heard Polyphemus's screams and asked who was hurting him, the blinded giant roared, "Nobody is killing me," and his brothers, assuming no real harm had been done, left him to his pain. Odysseus and his men escaped by tying themselves to the undersides of Polyphemus's sheep, slipping past the blind giant when he let his flock out to graze. It was a brilliant escape, a triumph of cleverness over brute strength. But Odysseus, in a moment of fatal pride, could not resist one final taunt. As his ship sailed away, he called back to the shore, revealing his true name and his homeland, shouting his identity for all to hear. This act of hubris, of excessive pride that leads to downfall, was exactly the kind of mistake that invited divine punishment in Greek thought. Polyphemus, hearing Odysseus's real name, lifted his hands to the sky and prayed to his father. "Hear me, Poseidon," he cried, "if I am truly your son. Grant that Odysseus may never reach his home, or if he must return, let him arrive late, in misery, having lost all his companions, in a stranger's ship, to find trouble in his house." Poseidon heard his son's prayer, and Poseidon answered it. For 10 years after leaving Troy, Odysseus wandered the Mediterranean, prevented from reaching his home of Ithaca by Poseidon's relentless persecution. Every time Odysseus seemed close to reaching home, Poseidon would intervene. The god would send storms that scattered his ships, would strand him on islands, would set obstacles in his path. When Odysseus built a raft and sailed from the island where he had been held captive by the nymph Calypso, Poseidon spotted him and immediately stirred up a storm so violent that it completely destroyed the raft and nearly killed the hero. What is striking about this pursuit is its duration and its intensity. 10 years is a long time to maintain a grudge, even for a god. But Poseidon's anger did not diminish with time. He was relentless, pursuing Odysseus across the seas with single-minded determination. Even when other gods, including Zeus, felt that Odysseus had suffered enough, Poseidon was not appeased. He would not rest until the hero had paid the full price for the blinding of Polyphemus. This story illustrates not just Poseidon's capacity for wrath, but also the Greek understanding of divine justice. From a mortal perspective, Odysseus had been defending himself and his men against a monster who was eating them alive. Polyphemus had violated the sacred rules of hospitality, rules that were supposed to be inviolable in Greek society. By any reasonable standard, Odysseus was in the right to fight back. But divine justice operated by different rules. Polyphemus was Poseidon's son, and attacking him was an offense against Poseidon himself, regardless of the circumstances. Gods demanded respect and acknowledgement, and they punished those who harmed their offspring. The Greeks understood that interactions with the divine required careful navigation, that even justified actions could have terrible consequences if they offended the wrong deity. Poseidon's wrath was not limited to Odysseus, of course. Throughout Greek mythology, there are numerous examples of the god's anger bringing destruction to those who offended him. When the Phaeacians, a seafaring people who had always honored Poseidon, helped Odysseus return to Ithaca, the god was so angry that he turned their ship to stone as it returned to port and threatened to bury their entire city under a mountain. The Phaeacians had only been following the rules of hospitality, but by helping Poseidon's enemy, they had earned his wrath. After losing the contest for Athens to Athena, Poseidon's anger manifested as a flood that inundated the Thriasian plain, submerging land under seawater in an act of pure spite. The Athenians would have to make additional sacrifices to appease him and prevent further destruction. When the Greek heroes Ajax the Lesser and his crew survived a shipwreck during their return from Troy, Ajax boasted that he had escaped the sea despite the god's will. Poseidon heard this boast and was so offended by the hubris that he took his trident and split the rock Ajax was standing on, sending the hero tumbling into the sea where he drowned. Yet for all his capacity for destructive anger, Poseidon could also be generous and protective to those who honored him properly. Sailors who made appropriate offerings before voyages often experienced calm seas and favorable winds. Coastal cities that maintained temples to Poseidon and performed the proper rituals would prosper from trade and fishing. The god was not capricious in the sense of being random. There was a logic to his behavior, even if it was the logic of divine pride and honor rather than human fairness. Poseidon could also show favoritism, particularly to his children and to mortals who earned his respect. He helped many heroes on their quests, provided divine assistance in times of need, and even fell in love with mortals, though these relationships often had complicated outcomes. His love for the mortal woman Aethra resulted in the birth of Theseus, who would become one of the greatest heroes of Athens despite Poseidon's earlier conflict with that city. The god's mood could shift as quickly as the weather over the ocean. A calm sea could become stormy in moments. Likewise, Poseidon's favor could turn to anger with shocking speed. This unpredictability made him both respected and feared. Mortals could not take his goodwill for granted, could not assume that yesterday's calm meant tomorrow would be peaceful. Each voyage required new prayers, new offerings, new acknowledgments of his power. In some ways, this temperamental nature made Poseidon more relatable than some of the other gods. Where Zeus might seem distant in his authority, where Athena might seem too rational and calculating, Poseidon felt emotions immediately and expressed them directly. He loved passionately, hated fiercely, took offense easily, and forgave slowly. These were human qualities magnified to divine proportions, which perhaps made him easier to understand even as they made him more dangerous to offend. The ancient Greeks, living with the reality of the sea's power, understood that Poseidon's temperament was not a metaphor but a reflection of their lived experience. The sea did turn from calm to storm without warning. Ships did sink for no apparent reason. Earthquakes did strike without warning, destroying in seconds what had taken years to build. In Poseidon, they found an explanation for these terrifying events, and also a way to potentially influence them through worship and sacrifice. But they also knew that even their best efforts might not be enough. Poseidon was powerful, proud, and not easily controlled, even by Zeus himself. He was a force of nature, and forces of nature are by their very essence beyond complete human control. All one could do was show respect, make the appropriate offerings, avoid offense, and hope that when the storms came, they would pass over without destroying everything in their path. The many loves of Poseidon, like many of the Olympian gods, Poseidon's romantic life was complex, prolific, and often problematic by modern standards. He had a wife, Amphitrite, whom he loved in his way, but monogamy was not a concept that constrained the gods of Olympus. Poseidon took numerous lovers, both divine and mortal, and from these unions came children who would shape the mythological landscape of ancient Greece. Amphitrite herself had not been eager to become Poseidon's wife. She was a Nereid, one of the 50 daughters of the sea god Nereus, beautiful and free, dwelling in the depths. When Poseidon first saw her dancing with her sisters, he was immediately captivated. But when he approached her with his intentions, Amphitrite fled, unwilling to bind herself to the powerful but temperamental sea god. She retreated to the Atlas Mountains at the far western edge of the world, but Poseidon would not be deterred. He sent searchers throughout the seas to find her, and it was Delphinus, the dolphin, who succeeded. With honey-tongued words and persuasive arguments, Delphinus convinced Amphitrite to give Poseidon a chance, to see past his reputation for anger and recognize the love he offered. She agreed, and returned with Delphinus to become Poseidon's wife and queen of the seas. In gratitude, Poseidon placed the dolphin's image among the stars as the constellation Delphinus. Amphitrite and Poseidon had 3 children together, and these were among the most famous of his offspring. Their son Triton was born as a merman, the upper body of a man transitioning seamlessly into the tail of a fish. He became his father's herald, carrying a conch shell that he would blow to calm or stir the waves according to Poseidon's will. Triton was generally benevolent, helping sailors and serving his father faithfully. They also had 2 daughters. Benthesisime was raised in the depths and eventually married a king of Ethiopia, bringing Poseidon's blessing to that distant land. Rhode, or Rhodos, became the personification of the island of Rhodes, later marrying Helios, the god of the sun. Through Rhode, Poseidon's bloodline merged with that of the Titan sun god, creating connections across the divine family. But despite his marriage to Amphitrite, Poseidon could not or would not remain faithful. His affairs were numerous, and they provide insight into his character, his desires, and the often tragic consequences when gods pursued mortals. One of the most famous and tragic of these affairs involved Medusa. In some versions of her myth, Medusa began life as a beautiful maiden, a priestess of Athena so lovely that she caught Poseidon's attention. Overcome by desire, Poseidon pursued her into Athena's temple itself. What happened next is told differently in different sources. Some say Medusa was willing, others that she was not, but the result was that Poseidon and Medusa lay together in Athena's sacred space. Athena, enraged by this desecration of her temple, punished Medusa by transforming her into a monster. Her beautiful hair became writhing snakes, her lovely face became hideous, and her gaze gained the power to turn any living thing to stone. Whether Medusa was a victim who deserved sympathy or a willing participant who earned her transformation has been debated for millennia, but one thing is certain. When the hero Perseus later beheaded Medusa, 2 beings sprang from her severed neck, Chrysaor and Pegasus, both children of Poseidon, both born in the most unusual way imaginable. Pegasus, the winged horse, would become one of the most famous creatures in all of mythology, a symbol of inspiration and poetry, later captured and ridden by the hero Bellerophon in his adventures. That such a noble creature could be born from violence and tragedy speaks to the complex nature of the myths and their refusal to present simple moral lessons. Poseidon's pursuit of his sister Demeter produced similarly complicated results. Demeter, grieving the abduction of her daughter Persephone by Hades, was wandering the earth in anguish when Poseidon decided he wanted her. To escape his advances, Demeter transformed herself into a mare and hid among a herd of horses. But Poseidon simply transformed himself into a stallion and pursued her anyway. From this union came two offspring, the nymph Despoina, who would be worshipped in the Eleusinian mysteries, and the horse Arion, who could speak with a human voice and run faster than the wind. The pursuit of Demeter shows Poseidon at perhaps his worst, using his power to overcome resistance, transforming himself to overcome barriers, taking what he wanted regardless of whether it was freely given. This aspect of his mythology is deeply troubling to modern sensibilities, and rightly so. It reflects the patriarchal values of ancient Greek society, where male gods' desires often overrode female autonomy, where power imbalances were simply accepted as the way things were. With mortal women, Poseidon's affairs often began with transformation. He appeared to them in various forms, perhaps knowing that his true divine appearance might be overwhelming or dangerous. When he desired the mortal woman Aethra, some traditions say he came to her in the guise of her fiancée, though others say she willingly sought him out. From their union came Theseus, who would grow up to become one of Athens's greatest heroes, slayer of the Minotaur and king of that city. The irony of Poseidon fathering one of Athens's greatest heroes was not lost on the ancient Greeks. Poseidon had lost the contest for Athens to Athena, had flooded their plain in anger, and yet his son would become the city's most celebrated mortal protector. Theseus himself navigated this complicated parentage carefully. When King Minos challenged Theseus to prove his divine heritage by retrieving a ring thrown into the sea, Theseus dove in and not only recovered the ring but returned with a golden crown given to him by Amphitrite herself, showing that even Poseidon's wife acknowledged his son. Tyro, daughter of Salmoneus, fell in love with the river Enopeus. Poseidon, desiring her, took the form of the river god and appeared to her. From this deceptive union came twins, Peleus and Neleus, who would both become kings and establish important royal lineages. This pattern of deception, taking another form to seduce a woman who would not otherwise have been willing, appears repeatedly in Poseidon's myths. Not all of Poseidon's mortal lovers were deceived or coerced, however. Some seem to embrace the relationship, though the myths often don't give us enough detail to know for certain. What is clear is that being loved by Poseidon, whether willing or not, often brought complications. Jealous partners might seek revenge, other gods might interfere, and the children born from these unions typically faced extraordinary challenges simply because of their divine parentage. The most elaborate myth involving Poseidon as a lover comes from Plato's account of Atlantis, which we'll explore in more detail later. In this tale, Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, who lived on a beautiful island in the Atlantic Ocean. He surrounded her dwelling with concentric rings of land and water to protect her, and made her his wife. Together they had 5 sets of twin sons, 10 kings who would rule the island of Atlantis and create one of the greatest civilizations ever known, before it was eventually destroyed and sank beneath the waves. These love affairs, consensual and non-consensual, willing and coerced, produced a tremendous number of children. Beyond those already mentioned, Poseidon fathered giants like Antaeus and Polyphemus, heroes like Bellerophon and Orion, countless minor nymphs and gods, and the founders of numerous Greek cities and tribes. Ancient royal families throughout the Greek world claimed descent from Poseidon, using his divine blood to legitimize their rule. Amphitrite's reaction to all these affairs is not extensively documented in the myths that survived, but it was not always silent acceptance. When Poseidon developed an infatuation with Scylla, a beautiful nymph, Amphitrite grew jealous and acted. She took magical herbs and cast them into the pool where Scylla bathed, transforming the lovely nymph into a six-headed monster who would devour sailors from a cave overlooking the Strait of Messina. This act of revenge shows that even the Queen of the Seas had limits to what she would tolerate, and that she had her own power to wield when provoked. The children of Poseidon, numerous and varied, carried their father's blood into the mortal world and across the divine realm. Some became gods themselves, ruling over aspects of the sea or other domains. Others became heroes, performing great deeds and earning immortal fame. Still others became monsters, embodying the more terrifying aspects of their father's power. And through the mortal descendants of his children, Poseidon's influence touched countless generations of Greeks, who honored him partly because they believed his blood ran in their veins. Contests and rivalries, Poseidon's competitive nature, and his sensitivity to perceived slights led him into several famous contests and rivalries with other gods. The most famous of these was his contest with Athena for the patronage of what would become one of the greatest cities in ancient Greece, Athens. In the early days after the Titanomachy, cities were being founded throughout Greece, and the gods competed to become patrons of these new settlements. Being the patron deity of a city meant receiving worship, sacrifices, and honor from its people. It meant having a special connection to that place and its destiny. So when a new city was being established on the plain of Attica, built around the hill of the Acropolis, both Poseidon and Athena saw it as a prize worth claiming. The king of this newly founded city was Cyclops, a figure said to be half man and half serpent, one of the autochthonous people who emerged from the earth itself. It was Cyclops who was chosen to judge between the two gods, to decide which of them would become the city's patron based on the gifts they offered. Poseidon went first. With dramatic flair, he struck his trident against the rocky ground of the Acropolis. The earth split open, and water began to flow, creating a spring on the hilltop. The demonstration was impressive, showing Poseidon's power to bring water from solid rock, to create springs even in elevated places. Some versions say he also created or gifted a horse to the people, that magnificent creature that symbolized strength and speed and military might. But there was a problem with Poseidon's gift. The water that flowed from the spring was salt water, like the sea itself. While this demonstrated Poseidon's connection to maritime power, it was not particularly useful to the people of the city. They needed fresh water for drinking and agriculture, and the sea was already nearby if they needed access to salt water. The gift, though impressive in its display of power, lacked practical value. Athena's approach was different. Without dramatic gestures or obvious displays of divine power, she knelt and planted something in the soil of the Acropolis. Within moments, a tree began to grow, an olive tree, with silvery green leaves and branches that would bear fruit. This was Athena's gift, the olive. The value of Athena's gift was immediately apparent. Olives provided food that could be eaten fresh or preserved. The oil from olives could be used for cooking, for lighting lamps, for anointing the body, for medicine, and for trade. The wood of the olive tree was useful for building and crafting. The tree itself was hardy, able to survive drought and poor soil, and it could live for hundreds of years. It was a gift that would keep giving, generation after generation. Cyclops considered both gifts carefully. Poseidon's spring, while impressive, offered little that the city didn't already have access to through the nearby sea. Athena's olive tree offered practical benefits that would improve every aspect of life. The choice, when it came down to practical value over impressive display, was clear. Cyclops declared Athena the winner. The city would be named Athens in her honor, and she would be its patron goddess. The Acropolis would become sacred to her, and temples would rise in her name. Poseidon's reaction was explosive. He was furious at being rejected, at having his gift deemed inferior to Athena's, at losing what he saw as rightfully his. In his anger, he flooded the Thriasian plain, submerging fertile farmland under seawater. The message was clear. If the city would not honor him as its patron, it would feel his wrath. Eventually, the Athenians managed to appease Poseidon with additional honors and sacrifices, and the flooding receded. A temple was built that honored both Athena and Poseidon, the Erechtheion, which contained both the mark of Poseidon's trident on the rock and the sacred olive tree of Athena. Both deities would be worshipped in Athens, though Athena would forever hold the primary place. This contest reveals much about Poseidon's character. He could not accept defeat gracefully, could not simply acknowledge that Athena's gift had been more useful. His pride was wounded, and in that wound, he lashed out with destructive force. It also shows the difference in how the two gods operated. Athena with wisdom and foresight, offering something of lasting value, and Poseidon with immediate power and impact, offering something spectacular but ultimately less useful. The contest for Athens was not Poseidon's only rivalry, though it was his most famous. He competed with other gods for patronage of various locations throughout Greece and the Mediterranean. In Corinth, he lost to Helios, the sun god, though the isthmus near Corinth remained particularly sacred to Poseidon and became the site of the Isthmian Games held in his honor. He had a long-standing rivalry with Apollo over the city of Delphi. Both gods claimed the oracle there, with Poseidon having held it first, before Apollo took it over. Some traditions say Poseidon was actually the original occupant of the oracle site, before Apollo killed the serpent Python and claimed the sacred place for himself. These contests for patronage were more than just divine ego. They reflected real religious and political realities in ancient Greece. Different cities worshipped different gods as their primary patrons, and these allegiances shaped everything from trade relationships to military alliances. When cities went to war, they were in some sense fighting on behalf of their patron deities, with the gods themselves taking sides. Poseidon also had conflicts with other gods that went beyond simple competition. He once conspired with Hera and Athena to overthrow Zeus, binding the king of the gods with chains while he slept. The rebellion failed when Theseus summoned one of the Hecatonchires to free Zeus, and the conspirators faced Zeus's wrath. As punishment, Poseidon and Apollo, who had also participated, were forced to serve King Laomedon of Troy for a year, during which they built the city's famous walls. This servitude to a mortal king was deeply humiliating for gods of Poseidon's stature, and when Laomedon refused to pay them as promised after the walls were complete, Poseidon's anger was terrible. He sent a sea monster to ravage Troy's coastline, and his grudge against the city would persist for generations, ultimately manifesting in his support for the Greeks during the Trojan War. Poseidon's rivalry with Athena extended beyond their contest for Athens. The two gods often found themselves on opposite sides of conflicts, whether in divine politics or in mortal wars. Yet despite their competitions and conflicts, there was also mutual respect between them. Both were powerful, both were important to the Greek world, and both understood that the cosmic order required multiple gods each doing their part, even if they sometimes clashed in the process. These contests and rivalries show us Poseidon at his most complex, prideful and competitive, generous with his gifts but unable to accept rejection, powerful but sometimes defeated by cleverness or practicality. He wanted recognition, wanted to be acknowledged as important, as deserving of worship. When that recognition was given, he could be generous and protective. When it was withheld or given to another, his anger could shake the earth itself. Atlantis, Poseidon's island kingdom. Among all the stories associated with Poseidon, few have captured human imagination quite like the tale of Atlantis. This story comes to us not from Homer or Hesiod, not from the ancient poets who first told the myths of the gods, but from the philosopher Plato, who included it in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE. According to Plato's account, when the gods divided the world among themselves after the Titanomachy, the island of Atlantis was given to Poseidon. This was a magnificent island, larger than Libya and Asia combined according to the tale, located in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. The island was fertile and beautiful, blessed with natural resources and a climate that made it a paradise. On this island lived a mortal woman named Cleito, daughter of Evener and Leucippe, who were among the island's indigenous people. Poseidon saw Cleito and fell in love with her. When her parents died, leaving her alone, the god came to her and made her his wife. To protect her and create a home worthy of his mortal bride, Poseidon used his divine powers to reshape the island itself. He created an alternating pattern of concentric rings, 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land, that surrounded Cleito's dwelling place at the center of the island. These rings formed a natural fortress, protecting Cleito from any potential threats. Poseidon also created 2 springs on the central island, one of hot water and one of cold, ensuring that his beloved would always have access to pleasant bathing and drinking water. With Cleito, Poseidon had 5 sets of male twins, 10 sons in all. To each of these sons, he gave a portion of the island to rule, dividing Atlantis into 10 kingdoms. The eldest of the firstborn twins he named Atlas, and it was from Atlas that both the island and the ocean surrounding it took their names. Atlas was made the High King, ruling over his brothers, who each governed their own territories. The names of Atlas's brothers were Gadeirus, Amphias, Evaemon, Nesius, Autochthon, Eleusippus, Mestor, Ozas, and Diaprepes. Each was given dominion over a region of the island and a portion of its wealth and resources. They established their own capitals within their territories, but all acknowledged Atlas as the supreme ruler, as was his birthright. Under the rule of these 10 kings, Atlantis flourished and grew into one of the greatest civilizations ever known. The island itself was rich in natural resources. There were mountains that provided timber and precious metals. There were plains that yielded abundant crops. There were animals of every kind. Most remarkably, there was a metal called orichalcum, which existed nowhere else and which shone like fire. This metal was used extensively in the construction of Atlantis's great buildings and monuments. The Atlanteans were skilled engineers and builders. They constructed bridges across the rings of water, creating passages from the outer ocean to the center of the island. They dug a great canal from the sea to the outermost ring, allowing ships to sail into the heart of Atlantis. They built magnificent palaces and temples, the greatest of which was dedicated to Poseidon and Cleito. This temple to Poseidon stood in the center of the royal island, on the spot where Cleito had first been wooed by the sea god. It was enormous, a stadium in length and proportionally wide and tall, with its exterior covered in silver and its pinnacles covered in gold. Inside, the walls, pillars, and floor were covered with orichalcum, glowing with inner fire. At the center stood a golden statue of Poseidon so tall that his head nearly touched the ceiling, showing the god standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, with 100 Nereids riding dolphins arranged around him. The Atlanteans worshipped Poseidon above all other gods, offering bulls in sacrifice. The 10 kings would gather at the temple regularly to discuss the governance of the island and to renew their sacred oaths to each other. They would capture a bull using only wooden staffs and ropes, without weapons, and sacrifice it at the pillar where the laws of Atlantis were inscribed. They would mix the bull's blood with wine and pour it over the inscription, then drink from the mixture, binding themselves to uphold the laws and to judge fairly. For many generations, Atlantis prospered. The 10 kings ruled justly, following the laws that Poseidon had established. They lived simply despite their wealth, putting virtue above material gain. The civilization grew in knowledge and power, developing advanced technology and building fleets that could sail across the oceans. Atlantean influence spread far beyond their island, touching other lands and peoples. But over time, as Plato tells it, the divine blood in the Atlantean royal lines became diluted by mortal admixture. With each passing generation, The kings became more human and less divine. And with this change came moral corruption. The Atlanteans began to value wealth over wisdom, power over justice. They became proud, arrogant, and aggressive. They looked upon other lands not as potential friends, but as targets for conquest. The corruption of Atlantis manifested in imperial ambition. The Atlantean kings assembled vast armies and fleets and set out to conquer the Mediterranean world. They successfully subjugated much of Libya and Europe, pushing eastward toward Athens and Egypt. It seemed as though nothing could stop their advance, that Atlantis would bring all of the known world under its dominion. But Athens, according to Plato's tale, stood against them. The Athenians, though vastly outnumbered, fought with courage and skill, defending not just their own city but all of Greece and beyond. In a great battle, the Athenian forces defeated the Atlantean invaders, driving them back and liberating the lands they had conquered. It was a triumph of virtue over vice, of courage over might, of a just society over a corrupted one. And then came the final judgment. Zeus, looking down from Olympus, saw how far Atlantis had fallen from its original virtue. He called a council of the gods to determine what should be done about this once great civilization that had become so corrupted. Here, frustratingly, Plato's account breaks off mid-sentence. His dialogue Critias ends abruptly, never telling us what Zeus decided at that divine council or what became of Atlantis. Whether Plato intended to continue the story and never did, or whether the ending was lost to time, we cannot know. But other ancient traditions, and the enduring popular understanding of the myth, filled in what Plato left unfinished. According to these later accounts, catastrophe struck Atlantis in a single day and night. Earthquakes shook the island, earthquakes that may have been caused by Poseidon himself, the earthshaker, perhaps acting on Zeus's judgment. The sea rose up in great waves, flooding the island. The land itself sank beneath the ocean, and Atlantis disappeared into the depths, becoming nothing more than a memory, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and moral corruption. Now, scholars widely agree that Plato never intended his story of Atlantis to be taken as literal history. He was a philosopher constructing an allegory to make points about politics, society, and the corrupting nature of imperial ambition. The story served as a warning to his fellow Athenians, showing what could happen to even the greatest civilizations when they abandoned virtue for conquest and material wealth. Whether Atlantis was inspired by real places destroyed by natural disasters, perhaps the Minoan civilization on Thera, devastated by volcanic eruption, or whether it sprang entirely from Plato's imagination remains debated, though most scholars lean toward the latter. Yet the story of Atlantis captured imaginations then and continues to do so today. People have searched for the lost island in every corner of the globe, from the Mediterranean to Antarctica, from the Caribbean to Southeast Asia. Countless theories have been proposed about where Atlantis really was, whether it was based on a real place destroyed by natural disaster, or whether it was purely Plato's invention. What matters for our purposes is what the story reveals about Poseidon. Here we see the sea god at his most creative and benevolent. He built a paradise for his mortal wife, reshaped an island to protect her, and fathered a dynasty that created one of the greatest civilizations in mythical history. He gave his sons laws to live by and established rituals that honored both justice and the divine. But the story also shows the limits of even divine parentage. Poseidon could not prevent his descendants from falling into corruption. He could not force them to remain virtuous. And when they failed, when they became a threat to the cosmic order, he either participated in their destruction or at least allowed it to happen. The message seems to be that even divine blood is no guarantee of virtue, that every generation must choose to live justly, and that failure to do so will eventually bring judgment. The image of Atlantis sinking beneath the waves, claimed by the sea that its founder had ruled, is powerful and tragic. It's a reminder that Poseidon, for all his power, ruled a realm that could swallow anything: islands, ships, cities, civilizations. The sea gives, but the sea also takes away, and Poseidon, as lord of that realm, embodied both aspects. He could create island paradises and prosperous kingdoms, but he could also drag them down into the darkness of the deep when they failed to honor the principles he valued. Whether Atlantis ever existed outside of Plato's imagination, it remains one of the most enduring myths associated with Poseidon, a story that shows the full range of his character. His capacity for love, his creative power, his role as both builder and destroyer, and his connection to a realm that is both source of life and bringer of death. Poseidon in the Trojan War, the great war between the Greeks and Trojans, immortalized in Homer's Iliad, involved all the Olympian gods, who took sides and influenced the course of the conflict. Poseidon's role in this war was complex, shaped by ancient grudges, divine politics, and his own changeable temperament. Poseidon's hostility toward Troy had roots that went back generations, to his servitude under King Laomedon. When Poseidon and Apollo were forced to serve this mortal king as punishment for their rebellion against Zeus, they had built the magnificent walls of Troy, using their divine skills to create fortifications that would have been impregnable to normal assault. When Laomedon refused to pay them their promised wages, both gods were furious, but Poseidon's anger manifested in a particularly devastating way. He sent a sea monster to ravage Troy's coastline, a creature that could only be appeased by the sacrifice of Laomedon's daughter Hesione. Though Heracles eventually saved Hesione and killed the monster, the grudge between Poseidon and the Trojan royal house persisted. It was this ancient resentment that colored Poseidon's involvement in the Trojan War, making him one of the Greeks' most important divine supporters. Throughout the 10-year siege of Troy, Poseidon repeatedly intervened on behalf of the Greek forces. When Zeus, bound by a promise to Thetis to honor her son Achilles by allowing the Trojans to triumph while Achilles sulked in his tent, forbade the other gods from interfering in the war, Poseidon chafed against this restriction. He argued that as master of the seas, he had his own authority and should not be subject to Zeus's commands in all things. Despite Zeus's prohibition, Poseidon found ways to help the Greeks. He would sometimes take the form of mortal warriors and move among the Greek troops, offering encouragement, providing tactical advice, or simply bolstering their spirits when they were flagging. His voice, when he shouted encouragement to the troops, was as loud as the battle cry of thousands of men, inspiring courage in the Greek warriors. He also directly entered the battlefield on occasion, fighting alongside the Greeks with devastating effect. With his trident in hand, Poseidon was a terrifying presence, shaking the earth beneath the Trojans' feet, creating confusion and fear in their ranks. He would rally the Greek defenders when the Trojans pressed their advantage, turning the tide of battle through sheer force of divine will. Yet for all his support of the Greeks, Poseidon was not uniformly hostile to every Trojan. When the fierce Greek warrior Achilles pursued the Trojan hero Aeneas, intending to kill him, Poseidon intervened to save the Trojan prince. His reasoning was practical rather than emotional. Aeneas was destined to survive the war and establish a new city for the Trojan refugees. Killing him would have violated fate itself, something even the gods were reluctant to do. This intervention shows Poseidon's complicated relationship with destiny and divine will. He supported the Greeks out of personal grudge and divine politics, but he also recognized that there were larger patterns at work, threads of fate that even his ancient anger could not be allowed to unravel. When preserving the destined future required saving a Trojan, Poseidon would do so, demonstrating a kind of cosmic responsibility that existed alongside his more immediate passions. The most dramatic demonstration of Poseidon's support for the Greeks came in the war's later stages. When the Trojan priest Laocoon attempted to warn his people about the wooden horse the Greeks had left outside Troy's gates, Poseidon sent two enormous sea serpents from the depths. These creatures emerged from the sea and made their way to where Laocoon stood with his two sons. The serpents wrapped around all three, and crushed them to death in full view of the horrified Trojans. The Trojans, seeing this as divine punishment for Laocoon's opposition to bringing the horse into the city, interpreted it as a sign from the gods that the horse should be accepted. They dragged it through their gates, not knowing it was filled with Greek warriors who would emerge that night to open the gates and let the Greek army in. Poseidon's intervention, killing Laocoon to silence his warnings, was instrumental in the final fall of Troy. After Troy's fall, as the Greek heroes began their journeys home, Poseidon's attitude toward them became more complex. On the one hand, they had been his allies, the instruments of his revenge against the Trojan royal house. On the other hand, they were Greek sailors crossing his domain, and any disrespect shown to him or his realm would be punished. We have already discussed Poseidon's relentless persecution of Odysseus for the blinding of Polyphemus. But Odysseus was not the only Greek hero to face Poseidon's wrath after the war. When Ajax the Lesser, during his return voyage, boasted that he had escaped the sea despite the gods' will, Poseidon split the rock he was standing on and drowned him. The message was clear. The sea god had helped the Greeks defeat Troy, but that did not mean they could show him disrespect. The Phaeacians, a seafaring people who had always honored Poseidon and maintained a special relationship with him, helped Odysseus complete his journey home. For this assistance to his enemy, Poseidon turned their ship to stone as it returned to port, transforming it into a rock formation that stood as a permanent reminder of his displeasure. He even threatened to bury their entire city under a mountain, and it took prayers and sacrifices to appease him enough that he relented. Poseidon's involvement in the Trojan War reveals several aspects of his character. His capacity for holding grudges across generations, Laomedon's offense leading to Poseidon's opposition to Laomedon's grandson Priam and his entire city. His willingness to defy even Zeus when his own passions were engaged, finding ways to help the Greeks despite his brother's prohibition. His pragmatism in recognizing when fate required him to protect rather than harm, and his expectation of respect and proper acknowledgement, even from those he had helped, punishing anyone who showed hubris or ingratitude. The war also showed how Poseidon's power could shape human events on a massive scale. His choice to support the Greeks was not neutral. It was a significant factor in their ultimate victory. Without his help, the war might have ended differently. The gods' involvement in human affairs was understood by the Greeks as a given, but Poseidon's participation in the Trojan War demonstrated just how decisive divine intervention could be. Creation myths and shaping the earth beyond his primary role as god of the sea, Poseidon was credited with various acts of creation and with physically shaping the world. These myths show him as more than just a ruler of existing waters. He was an active participant in the continuing creation of the world, capable of bringing forth new life and new features of the landscape. The most famous of Poseidon's creations was the horse. Multiple traditions credit the sea god with creating the first horses, though the circumstances vary between tellings. In one version, during his contest with Athena for Athens, Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, and from that spot sprang the first horse, a magnificent creature of power and speed. Though the Athenians chose Athena's olive tree over Poseidon's horse, the gift itself became one of the most important in all of Greek life. In another tradition, Poseidon created horses in Thessaly, a region famous for its horsemanship, as a gift to the hero Peleus. These were not ordinary horses but divine steeds, immortal and faster than the wind, capable of understanding human speech. The most famous of these divine horses would later be given to Achilles and would carry him through the battles of the Trojan War. The connection between Poseidon and horses is deeper than simple creation. Horses were associated with the sea in several ways. The churning of white water could look like galloping horses. The power and grace of horses resembled the power and beauty of the sea. In some traditions, when Poseidon traveled, his chariot was drawn not by fish-tailed hippocampi, but by actual horses who could run across the surface of the sea without sinking. This blending of terrestrial and maritime imagery reflected Poseidon's dual nature as both sea god and horse god. Poseidon was also famous for creating springs by striking the earth with his trident. Throughout Greece, numerous springs and wells were said to have been created this way, each one a reminder of the god's power. Sometimes these springs provided fresh water for communities in need. Other times, as on the Acropolis in Athens, they produced salt water, demonstrating Poseidon's connection to the sea but offering little practical benefit. One of the most important springs attributed to Poseidon was the Perrhae spring in Corinth. This spring provided fresh water to the city and was considered sacred. According to legend, the winged horse Pegasus was drinking from this spring when the hero Bellerophon, following Athena's advice, captured him there. The spring became a place where mortals could potentially encounter the divine, where the boundary between earth and water, between mortal and immortal, grew thin. Poseidon's power to create earthquakes meant he could literally reshape the landscape. When he struck the earth in anger or purpose, mountains could be split, valleys formed, islands created or destroyed. The Greeks attributed many geological features to Poseidon's actions. Islands were said to be pieces of land he had broken off from larger landmasses. Channels and straits were created when he split peninsulas. Underground passages and caves were formed by his movements beneath the earth. The islands of the Aegean Sea, scattered across those waters like stepping stones, were all under Poseidon's dominion. Some myths told of how he had placed these islands specifically to provide waypoints for sailors, making sea travel easier and safer. Others told of islands being torn from the mainland by the god's trident, whether in anger or for some other purpose. During the Gigantomachy, the war between the gods and the giants, Poseidon broke off a piece of the island of Kos and hurled it at the giant Polybotes, crushing him beneath it. This piece became the island of Naxiros, which still stands as a reminder of that ancient battle. The Greeks pointed to the volcanic activity on Naxiros as evidence that the giant still struggled beneath the island, creating tremors with his movements. Poseidon's creative acts extended to living things beyond horses. Various species of sea creatures were said to have been created by him or at his command. Dolphins, octopi, sea turtles, and countless fish species all fell under his protection. He could transform mortals into marine creatures as well, a punishment or a blessing depending on the circumstances. The Telchines, the ancient craftsmen of Rhodes, were sometimes said to have been given their flippered hands by Poseidon, making them equally at home in water and on land. The god also had the power to control the boundaries between land and sea. He could flood coastal regions, submerging them beneath the waves, effectively expanding his domain at the expense of the land. He could also drain swamps and wetlands, creating new dry land, though he did this less frequently. The Greeks, living on a peninsula surrounded by seas and islands, understood that the relationship between land and water was not fixed but dynamic, constantly shifting, and they saw Poseidon as the force behind these changes. In some traditions, Poseidon worked together with other gods in acts of creation. He and Athena both contributed to the creation of the bridle and other horse-riding equipment, though they competed over who had invented it first. He worked with Apollo to build the walls of Troy, though this was compelled service rather than willing cooperation. These collaborative efforts showed that even a god as powerful and independent as Poseidon sometimes needed to work with others to achieve certain goals. But more often, Poseidon's creative acts were solitary expressions of his will. When he desired to create something, he would strike his trident against earth or sea, and the thing would come into being. This direct, forceful method of creation matched his personality perfectly. Where Athena might carefully design and plan her creations, where Apollo might craft them with artistic skill, Poseidon simply commanded them into existence through sheer divine power. These creation myths served multiple purposes for the ancient Greeks. They explained the origins of important features of their world: horses, springs, islands, various geographical features. They demonstrated Poseidon's power and importance, showing him as an active force in shaping the world rather than merely ruling over an existing domain. And they provided etiological stories, narratives that explained why things were the way they were, connecting the physical world to the realm of myth and divine action. Sacred sites and worship of Poseidon. The worship of Poseidon was widespread throughout ancient Greece, particularly in coastal regions and areas dependent on maritime trade. His temples, sanctuaries, and sacred sites served as centers of religious devotion and as reminders of his power over the natural world. The most famous and visually striking of Poseidon's temples stood at Cape Sounion, at the southeastern tip of Attica. Built on a cliff overlooking the Aegean Sea, this temple was one of the last sights Greek sailors would see as they left home, and the first sight that greeted them on their return. Its position made it a natural place for mariners to offer prayers and sacrifices, thanking Poseidon for safe passage or asking for his protection on journeys to come. The temple at Sounion was built in the 5th century BCE, during Athens's Golden Age, using gleaming marble that could be seen from far out at sea. Sailors approaching Athens would see the temple's columns catching the sunlight, a beacon of divine presence watching over the waters. Even in ruins today, the temple at Sounion remains one of the most evocative sites of ancient Greek religion, a place where the connection between the divine and the natural world feels almost tangible. Near Corinth, at the isthmus that connected mainland Greece to the Peloponnese, stood another of Poseidon's most important sanctuaries. This location was strategically vital, controlling the narrow strip of land between two seas. Here, Poseidon was honored not just as god of the sea, but as protector of travelers crossing between different bodies of water. The sanctuary became famous as the site of the Isthmian Games, one of the 4 great Panhellenic festivals that drew athletes and spectators from across the Greek world. The Isthmian Games, held every 2 years, featured athletic competitions similar to those at Olympia, but with a particular emphasis on equestrian events, races and competitions involving horses, creatures sacred to Poseidon. Winners received crowns woven from wild celery, a plant sacred to the god. The games were more than just sporting events. They were religious festivals, times when all of Greece would gather to honor Poseidon through competition, sacrifice, and celebration. At Pylos, on the west coast of the Peloponnese, Poseidon was worshipped as early as the Mycenaean period, centuries before the classical Greek civilization. Linear B tablets found at Pylos show that Poseidon was the primary deity of that Bronze Age palace, receiving the largest number of offerings among the male gods and having a sanctuary near the palace itself. This suggests that his worship was ancient indeed, perhaps going back to pre-Greek cultures in the region. Both priests and priestesses held important positions in Pylian religious life, with priestesses typically serving goddesses while priests served male deities like Poseidon. Inland sites also honored Poseidon, particularly in Arcadia, where he was worshipped primarily as a horse god with the epithet Hippios. In this landlocked region, Poseidon's association with springs and fresh water sources was more important than his connection to the sea. Sanctuaries in eastern Arcadia, an area prone to flooding, emphasized Poseidon's role as both cause of and protection from water-related disasters. The worship of Poseidon followed certain consistent patterns across different sites. Before sea voyages, sailors would pour libations of wine into the water, speaking prayers for safe passage. These offerings acknowledged Poseidon's power over their fate, a recognition that they traveled in his realm and needed his permission and protection to do so safely. Failure to make proper offerings could result in storms, shipwrecks, or simply being lost at sea. Sacrifices to Poseidon most commonly involved bulls, powerful animals that matched the god's own strength. The bulls would be led to the sea's edge, blessed, and then sacrificed, with portions of their flesh burned for the god and the rest shared among the worshippers in a communal feast. In some locations, horses were sacrificed to Poseidon, thrown into the sea or into sacred pools associated with his worship. These equine sacrifices were expensive and relatively rare, performed only for the most important occasions or the most desperate circumstances. Some of the worship practices associated with Poseidon were unique to specific locations. At Onchestus in Boeotia, there was a peculiar ritual involving riderless chariots. Horses would be yoked to a chariot and allowed to run free through the sacred grove. If the chariot crashed, it was dedicated to the god. If it completed the course intact, the horses and chariot were taken back by their owner. This ritual perhaps acknowledged both the wildness of horses and the potential for chaos that Poseidon represented. At the promontory of Mycale in Ionia, 12 Ionian cities gathered for the Pannonia, a religious festival honoring Poseidon Heliconios. This was not just a religious gathering but a political one, where the Ionian League would meet to discuss matters of common concern. The temple served as neutral ground where political rivals could meet under the god's protection, acknowledging their shared heritage and shared religious identity. Festivals honoring Poseidon typically occurred in the winter months when sailing was dangerous and most ships remained in port. The Festival of Poseidonia, held in various coastal cities, featured processions, sacrifices, athletic competitions, and communal feasting. These celebrations acknowledged the god's power while also marking the season when his realm was most dangerous, when storms were frequent and the sea showed its most destructive face. The worship of Poseidon also involved smaller, more personal devotions. Fishermen would make offerings before casting their nets, asking for an abundant catch. Merchants would dedicate a portion of their profits from successful trading voyages to the god. Travelers would leave votive offerings at coastal shrines, small tokens of gratitude for safe passage. These individual acts of devotion, accumulated across thousands of people over centuries, demonstrated how deeply Poseidon was woven into the fabric of daily life in ancient Greece. Certain objects became associated with Poseidon worship: models of ships, dolphins carved from stone or clay, images of horses, miniature tridents. These votive offerings would accumulate in temples and sanctuaries, physical evidence of the prayers and thanks offered to the god. Archaeologists have found thousands of these objects at sites associated with Poseidon, testament to the continuity and intensity of his worship. The god was invoked under various epithets depending on the aspect of his power being addressed. As Poseidon Asphalios, Poseidon the Stabilizer, he was asked to protect against earthquakes. As Poseidon Pelagios, Poseidon of the open sea, he was honored by those who sailed beyond sight of land. As Poseidon Hippios, he received offerings from those concerned with horses. These different titles reflected the understanding that Poseidon's power manifested in multiple ways, and that different circumstances called for appealing to different aspects of his nature. Women participated in Poseidon's worship, though the extent of their role varied by location. At some sites, priestesses led the rituals. At others, women had specific ceremonies of their own. The wife of Poseidon, Amphitrite, was sometimes honored alongside him, particularly in maritime contexts. The Nereids, those 50 daughters of Nereus who dwelt in the sea, were also associated with Poseidon's worship, representing the feminine aspect of the ocean's power. The Romans, when they conquered Greece, identified Poseidon with their own sea god Neptune. Neptune had originally been a god of fresh water and springs, but under Greek influence, he became virtually identical to Poseidon. The Romans maintained many of the Greek worship practices, though they placed less emphasis on Poseidon's connection to horses and earthquakes, focusing more exclusively on his maritime aspects. Neptune's festival, the Neptunalia, was held in the heat of summer, reflecting Rome's different climate and agricultural calendar. Into late antiquity, Poseidon remained an important deity, one of the last of the Olympian gods to maintain significant worship even as Christianity spread. Sailors, always a superstitious group, were reluctant to abandon the god who they believed controlled their fate. Coastal communities continued traditional rites long after other aspects of pagan religion had faded. The transition away from Poseidon worship was gradual, with some maritime traditions simply transferring to Christian saints associated with the sea. The legacy of the Earthshaker as we come to the end of our journey through the mythic life of Poseidon, it's worth reflecting on what this god represented to the ancient Greeks, and what his stories still have to offer us today. Poseidon was many things: ruler of the seas, shaker of the earth, creator of horses, father of heroes and monsters, rival to other gods, loyal supporter and implacable enemy. He was generous to those who honored him and terrible to those who offended him. He was capable of love and of terrible violence, of creation and of destruction. He was, in short, complex and contradictory, embodying qualities that sometimes seemed at odds with each other. This complexity made Poseidon one of the most compelling figures in Greek mythology. Unlike some gods who had more clearly defined roles and personalities, Poseidon refused to be easily categorized. Was he primarily a sea god or a horse god? Was he more creator or destroyer? Was he to be loved or feared? The answer to all these questions was yes. He was all of these things, simultaneously, with different aspects coming to the forefront in different circumstances. For the ancient Greeks, Poseidon represented the reality of their relationship with the sea. The Mediterranean was essential to Greek life and civilization. It provided food through fishing, it enabled trade that brought prosperity, it connected the scattered Greek communities across a wide geographic area. But the sea was also dangerous. Storms could arise with little warning, ships could be lost, sailors could drown. The sea gave life, but it also took life away, and there was no predicting which aspect you would encounter on any given voyage. Poseidon embodied this dual nature perfectly. When you sailed, you were in his realm, subject to his whims. You could pray to him, make offerings, show proper respect, and hope that he would look favorably upon you. But there was no guarantee. Even the most pious sailor could encounter a storm. Even the best offerings might not prevent disaster. The sea, and its divine personification, were fundamentally beyond complete human control. The same was true of earthquakes, those terrifying events where the solid ground betrayed its promise of stability and safety. The Greeks had no scientific understanding of plate tectonics or geological forces, but they experienced earthquakes regularly and knew their devastating power. Attributing them to Poseidon gave these events meaning, made them part of the divine order rather than random catastrophes. If Poseidon caused earthquakes, then perhaps he could also be persuaded to prevent them, or at least to make them less severe. Poseidon's connection to horses added another dimension to his character. Horses were valuable animals in ancient Greece, essential for warfare, agriculture, and transportation. They were also beautiful, powerful, and somewhat dangerous. A horse could kill a person, accidentally or deliberately, and handling them required skill and respect. In making Poseidon the creator and patron of horses, the Greeks connected him to these majestic but dangerous creatures, seeing in them a reflection of the sea god's own nature. The stories of Poseidon's loves and his children show the god at his most human, pursuing what he desired with single-minded determination, but also capable of genuine affection. His marriage to Amphitrite, despite his many affairs, endured throughout the myths. His children, both divine and monstrous, spread his influence throughout the Greek world. Through Theseus and other heroic sons, Poseidon remained connected to mortal affairs, his bloodline flowing through the veins of Greek heroes and kings. Poseidon's rivalries and contests reveal his competitive nature and his sensitivity to perceived slights. The contest for Athens, his conflicts with other gods, his long-running grudges, all of these show a god who demanded recognition and respect, who could not bear to be overlooked or undervalued. This pride was dangerous, as many mortals discovered when they earned Poseidon's wrath, but it was also very human, making the god relatable despite his cosmic power. The story of Atlantis, whether historical or purely fictional, has become one of the most enduring legends associated with Poseidon. It shows him as both builder and destroyer, creator of a great civilization and participant in its downfall. The image of that advanced island kingdom sinking beneath the waves has captivated imaginations for over 2,000 years, spawning countless theories and searches. It remains a powerful symbol of both human achievement and human fallibility, of how even the greatest civilizations can fall when they abandon virtue. Today, Poseidon remains a recognizable figure in popular culture. His trident is still a symbol of the sea and of maritime power. His name evokes images of storms and shipwrecks, of underwater kingdoms and sea monsters. He appears in literature, film, and other media as a force of nature personified, powerful and unpredictable. Modern retellings sometimes soften his more problematic aspects, but they generally maintain his core characteristics. His command over the seas, his temperamental nature, his tremendous power. The environmental relevance of Poseidon has taken on new meaning in our age of climate change and rising sea levels. The sea that Poseidon ruled is demonstrating its power in ways the ancient Greeks could barely have imagined, threatening coastal cities, changing weather patterns, affecting every aspect of life on Earth. We may no longer believe in Poseidon as a literal god, but the forces he represented, the power of water, the unpredictability of nature, the need to respect what we cannot control, remain as relevant as ever. What lessons can we draw from Poseidon's myths? Perhaps the most important is the need for humility in the face of natural forces. The Greeks knew that the sea demanded respect, that earthquakes could not be prevented through human effort alone, that some powers were beyond mortal control. In our technological age, when we sometimes believe we can master nature through engineering and science, Poseidon's myths remind us that nature is ultimately more powerful than we are, and that wisdom lies in learning to work with natural forces rather than trying to dominate them completely. The myths also teach us about the consequences of disrespect and the importance of acknowledgement. Poseidon punished those who showed hubris, who boasted of overcoming his power or who failed to honor him properly. In modern terms, we might understand this as a warning about arrogance, about the dangers of assuming we are in control when we are not. The sea, like Poseidon, will punish those who disrespect it, who sail unprepared, who assume they are immune to its dangers. But the myths also show Poseidon's generosity to those who approached him correctly. Sailors who made proper offerings often received safe passage. Cities that honored him prospered from maritime trade. Heroes who had his favor could accomplish great deeds. The message is that relationship matters, that approaching powerful forces, whether divine or natural, with respect and proper acknowledgement can make the difference between success and disaster. As we conclude our exploration of Poseidon's mythic life, we see a god who was essential to ancient Greek civilization and whose stories still resonate today. He was the power of the sea made manifest, the personification of forces that could nurture or destroy, create or consume. He was a god who demanded respect, who could be generous or terrible, who shaped the world through his actions and his will. The Earth-Shaker, the Lord of the Seas, the creator of horses and father of heroes, the rival of Athena and the pursuer of many lovers, the builder of Atlantis and the drowner of Ajax. All of these aspects, contradictory and complementary, formed the complex deity that was Poseidon. His legacy continues in every ship that crosses the ocean, in every earthquake that reminds us of the Earth's power, in every horse that runs with beauty and strength. The ancient temples may be ruins, the sacrifices no longer offered, the prayers no longer spoken. But the forces Poseidon represented, the sea, the earth, the untamed aspects of nature, remain as powerful as ever, commanding our respect, inspiring our awe, and reminding us that there are powers in the universe that transcend human understanding and control. May your own journey through life be as fortunate as a voyage with calm seas and favorable winds. May you show proper respect to forces beyond your control. And may you remember that sometimes the most powerful forces are also the most beautiful, and that learning to appreciate both aspects is the key to wisdom. If you enjoyed this exploration of Poseidon and his place in Greek mythology, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to Slumber Scrolls for more deep dives into the stories and characters that have shaped human culture across the millennia. Sleep well, and may your dreams be as deep and mysterious as the ocean depths that Poseidon once ruled. Until next time.